You are a feminist. How does that go over in the Muslim world?
So I usually don't start with the word feminist, but I do use that word to describe myself just because I think it's really important that we own a word that unites us. But the way I often describe Islam is a revolution for women. And the first person to enter Islam was a woman. The first martyr in Islam was a woman. When the Quran was compiled and the tribes decided who to give it to, it was a woman.
Hello, I'm Bonnie Bay. Welcome to the Contrary. This week, a conversation with Manal Omar. Manal has founded a new organization called Across Red Lines, and we'll be telling you what that is about, and it's very exciting. She's also a Truman National Security Fellow, and she's a thought leader when it comes to issues at the intersection of gender, equality, and Islam. Welcome, Manal, and of course, frequent To the Contrary panelist as well.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Across Red Lines, what is that about?
So Across Red Lines is a company that I just launched that looks at providing women, particularly Muslim women, but women of faith in general, with a safe space to explore sexuality from a religious lens.
And no such thing exists after you're surveying the Islamic world?
Well, there's different women's organizations across the Islamic world, and a lot of them that I've been working with and pulled on and stuff. But to be really honest, just from my own personal experience, when I went through my divorce, I had so much struggles and so many questions about my own sexuality, about my faith, about my role as a woman's rights activist, at a time when it felt like Islam and women's rights were at complete contradiction. And so I started to look. I looked for workshops, I looked for books, and just there wasn't anything. And it was almost a point of desperation. And so I've spent the last 3 years really doing the research for myself. And then that kind of inspired me. It was like, why don't I share it? And that's what launched Across Red Lines.
I believe the lack of conversation about sexuality has crippled our community.
When I ask people, what is your idea about getting to know someone for the purpose of marriage, they'll use other words like courting, or I'm talking, or getting to know.
Open, honest discussions about sexuality is a red line that even the most powerful Muslim women will not cross. I want to cross it.
Now, tell me about have you been besieged with inquiries from women who want to know more? What is the average about sex and sexuality? Let's start with here in the U.S.
Yep.
Muslim women, what's their level of knowledge?
So, it's very hard, as you know, to speak about women as a monolith, period, and Muslim women in general, and then especially when you come to American Muslim women, just because there's such a diverse cultural background as well. But what overwhelmingly has been seen is that it is just very male-dominated interpretations when it comes to anything involving women in Islam. So there has been such strong success in the last 20 years on raising the rights issues. What hasn't happened is really the conversation on sexuality, and especially from a sex-positive lens. We've had great organizations tackling domestic violence, tackling, sexual abuse in the mosque. We've really had organizations step up in the last, I would say, decade in America, and I would say in the world. But that sex-positive conversation, which I argue is an essential part of Islam, because Islam talks about how you connect with the divine through all your senses, is still a missing gap. And when we're only focusing on the exploitation and we're only focusing on the abuse, then we lose the other angle on women's issues, which is, again, the joy, the pleasure, and the resilience. And so my hope is that we can build that side through this lens on talking about sexuality.
Would you say that the Islamic community in America is more forward-thinking than, say, in North Africa or South Asia?
I would actually say the opposite. I was, raised here. I was taught Islam through the system here, and very much involved in the American Muslim community, and I'm grateful for it because it gave me such an important part of my background. But it wasn't until I started traveling the world that I saw how rich and open and liberal Islam actually is. My personal theory is that we get frozen in the time of when our parents left. And so I was raised in a 1960s Palestine because that's when my parents left. Whereas if you go to Palestine or wherever people are originally from, there tends to be a huge wide of interpretations. There's a huge wide of the way the religion is practiced. Whereas here, it's almost like we're frozen in time.
So how is it possible, for example, that in Nigeria, where Boko Haram is kidnapping schoolgirls, and as you told me prior to the taping, girls are not in school anymore, their parents are afraid to send them. How is it possible that they're more liberated, if you will, more progressive than American Muslim women who are lawyers and doctors and you know, university presidents and corporate CEOs, than you know, when compared with other countries?
I would differentiate between the interpretations and the scholarship and then the status of women. So there are two different. So obviously with the status of women, just by default, our access to education, our access to healthcare, we're always going to be better. What I was looking at is more of the Islamic interpretation lens, and that's which tends to be frozen in time. We don't have the access. And I also think in America...
Explain to me what you mean by...
So I'll give you an example. When I was in Nigeria, I was able to meet with Islamic scholars, invite them to the board for Across Red Lines, because I want the scholarship as well as the women's rights activists, and to really push them on certain issues that may trouble me from a women's perspective. So for example, on the witnesses, or you know, on what ISIS is using in terms of their recruitment strategies. So a lot of the times if I have those type of conversations here, what I get is read the scholarship that's already in the past. Whereas what you will find in some, not in all contexts and not all religious scholars, but you know, I had the same experience in Yemen, is if you find really people who know the religion and know the scripture, you can actually begin to deconstruct their laws. And the way that someone explained it to me, which I thought was brilliant in this recent trip to Nigeria, is, you know, Islam doesn't necessarily need a reformation the way that Christianity or other religions went, because it's a legal-based system. And so the values won't change, but from the beginning, Islam has always anticipated the laws to change. And so the laws should actually evolve and change with people, and that's what the scholars are supposed to be doing.
Let's go back. Let's talk about how that impacts the average woman in the U.S. versus the average woman in, say, the Philippines, or you know, or somewhere else in South Asia or North Africa. My experience, and I've been to 70 some odd countries, is that women are way more repressed in their daily lives.
Absolutely.
So that's what I was getting at before.
That's why I was trying to differentiate. In terms of daily lives, absolutely. I was thinking more in terms of the ammunition to push back on the specific conversation on sexuality. That ammunition is what we're lacking.
But they're women there treated in many countries no better than chattel, really.
Yeah, I mean, women worse.
You know, were treated in biblical times.
Yeah. Yeah. No, absolutely.
So when you you are a feminist.
Yes, absolutely.
How does that, when you tell people or you speak to an audience of Muslims here and overseas, how do they take that?
So I usually don't start with the word feminist, but I do use that word to describe myself, just because I think it's really important that we own a word that unites us. But the way I often describe Islam is a revolution for women. And you know, the first person to enter Islam was a woman. The first martyr in Islam was a woman. When the Quran was compiled and the tribes decided who to give it to, it was a woman. The person who introduced mysticism in Islam, you know, Sufism, was a woman, Rabia al-Alawiyya. So, you know, I use that as the entry point, especially with the religious scholars, saying, like, you know, with a point of pride of how revolutionary Islam was to women. And usually they get very excited and they'll share their own stories. And then I ask them, which is a truly heartfelt question, is when did we lose it? Because we've lost it. And then that usually can open up the conversation around feminism, around sexuality, and just kind of this argument of saying Islam was the original movement for a lot of these communities and it got lost. How do we reclaim it? And it just takes away the defensive posture in a world of Islamophobia of demanding reformation, demanding apology. It just allows people to come back to it from a place of pride again, which is how I reconnected with my religion, was from that place of pride.
And how are you getting the word out?
So again, just basic word of mouth and trying to raise awareness. We've done, you know, various workshops. What we did in Nigeria was by invitation. The university invited us to come, or invited me to come and speak. And so we're just being really responsive. I mean, what I'm trying to be very keen on is it's demand driven. You know, I don't go out, I don't advocate, I really, you know, just promote. I, you know, produce material. I have a sex column on muslimgirl.net for young Muslim women to be able to access. And so those who email and reach out to me are those who I respond to. I mean, I feel it's very important that it's such a sensitive topic that it's not one that I do advocacy around. It's one that I really just create safe space and allow people to come to.
Okay, and you would say that in terms of, even in the United States, the level of education that Muslim girls, in this case, are getting about sex education, about sex, about the biological functions, everything, you would say is very low?
The level is very, I would say, low, and it seems to be getting worse. And I think the biggest challenge is that the community as a whole, including, you know, our top women leaders, including some of our imams, we're really focused on fighting Islamophobia. And so much of the focus has been external that we haven't had the opportunity for that internal kind of revival and growth to take place.
And speaking of external reaction, you wear a headscarf all the time. What reaction do you get from Americans when you're out and about?
I mean, overall, there's just been a lot more tense. It's a lot more tense, as you probably heard over the spring. There was an attack in our mosque, and a young Muslim woman was killed. And so that really hits home for a lot of us. So it almost becomes irrelevant what the reality is, because we're living in this constant fear. Again, why I'm trying to help shift us away from a place of fear. So it's been a really difficult time. And there's been a lot of conversations. In fact, one of the major questions that I get is, should I take off the scarf? And so it's a constant.
What do you say?
I tell people for almost all the responses, they need to trust themselves. Nobody can answer that question for them except themselves. So I help them, you know, really ask the questions and get in touch with their own body and their own intuition, because I do believe the divine speaks to us in that way, and each woman has a different answer.
And isn't it seen as a pretty radical message by American Muslims, and certainly by not Muslims but extremists? I mean, do you worry about any getting attacked, or by saying that sexuality should be enjoyed, women should have it, should own their own sexuality, and it's a way of getting in touch with the divine? Doesn't that make some men really angry?
I mean, I will be honest, this trip, to northern Nigeria and this project is probably one of the scariest that I've done in a long time. I was there just right after the Boko Haram girls, or the Bring Back girls, were released by Boko Haram. So it was a very exciting time to be there, as a small window of opportunity was opening up. But this project, and you know the work that I've done, which includes Iraq, South Sudan, Afghanistan, this project is probably the one that frightens me the most. I'm not unaware of the challenge that comes, and I would say not just Muslim women, but the question on women owning their sexuality, and again, from a place of connecting with the divine, is a very hit on patriarchy. And so I don't think it's only Muslim men that will be upset. I think anyone invested in patriarchy is going to be upset.
And so how would you deal with it if you were seriously threatened? Would you back off?
I mean, I have been threatened, and when we were traveling up to northern Nigeria, I was told many times that you can't take that road trip between Yolo and Gombe, and even Nigerians from Abuja won't drive that road. So, I'm not naive about security. I take security very seriously. I do every 3 years hostile environment training. Like, I take security very seriously. I've lost too many women friends and allies to security situations. But as you know, backing down is just not an option. And again, I just really worry that women have been cornered into a place where we're just fighting. And I want to build the joy and the resilience in us again. That's one of the most powerful parts of the feminine. And it makes me sad that we're stuck in this battle, which is brilliant. And I honor all those who are at the front lines fighting for women's rights. I truly do, as someone who spent 20 years there as well. But it's time for us to unplug from the war machine and from the conflict machine, and to really talk about the power of women from a place of joy. And I know that's a hard sell, especially in this day and age, but someone has to ring that bell.
When you say, you do say women are going backward, you said rates of female genital mutilation, FGM, in the United States are going up. Obviously, well, teen pregnancies, at least to this point, have been going down, but births to unwed mothers are skyrocketing all over the place. So What is responsible for this? Why are women, and pay equity is not advancing as we thought it would?
I mean, it's hard to say what the root is because there are so many different factors that are playing into it. I think one of the things that I'm trying to do for myself is saying, okay, what we've done in the last 20 years hasn't worked. Actually, that's not a fair statement because it's worked significantly and it's gotten us very far. And again, I'm grateful for how far we have come. But we might want to think of a new strategy to take us to the next level. And that's where I think a lot of the efforts are that I'm trying to make. And so, you know, it's always hard when you're talking about numbers to say, is the research or is it an increase? But we do know that, you know, in Minneapolis and Detroit, you know, right here in Virginia, we've had an increase of, you know, conversations around FGM, and we're trying to really raise the awareness on how much it really, I mean, it's beyond physical abuse. It completely disconnects a woman from her body, and there's so many examples of practices that do that. And so we're launching the conversations, and again, we're trying to do it from a sex positive angle, but all 100% using Islamic framework. So it's all based on the Quran and the Hadith. We're not looking at revival, we're not looking at reinterpretation. The argument we're making is it's already there, we just don't know our own religion.
What influences, any, is the Trump presidency having on where Islamic girls in the United States are going?
Yeah.
Is it pushing them back? Is it making them militant so they're moving forward? What effect?
It's probably a combination. It's hard to really say, but I think that it's something that we're still struggling with. You definitely have, as with most social movements, like the Muslim women are at the front lines. So you have Linda Sarsour, Dalia Mujahid, really, you know, carrying the flag of the community as a whole, which does not, you know, is not different than what we saw in the Arab Spring, where women really kind of came up at the front lines. But we also know that's never really a guarantee to decision making or to change on a more, you know, day-to-day level. And so, you know, patriarch loves female mascots. And so we have to be really careful of that side of it as well. And then on the other end and on the community level, you know, I just really worry because, you know, again, at the mosque that I go to where this young woman was killed, you know, the question is, do we bring back muhram, which is male companion? You know, how do we make, you know, you have all kinds of self-defense classes that are now being offered, which worries me because one of the things that I often do when I do hostile environment training is warn women not to have a false sense of confidence. Like, you have to, situational awareness is more important than thinking you can attack. And so, you know, these type of issues are just, I never thought we would have these conversations in America, and I would be leading training for young women on that, you know? I mean, like, when I first was looking at Across Red Lines 3 years ago, my dream was to leap forward. What I'm finding is us barely able to keep status quo.
Jeez. That's really sad to hear, but obviously it's happening in many different ways.
Absolutely.
Now let's talk about ISIS. So you were recruited online by a predecessor to ISIS when you were a teenager in the 90s. Tell me about this. And now that they're losing control, losing ground, literally, in Syria and other places, and estimates, I've heard estimates that their numbers are shrinking. Is this true in terms of their online recruitment?
So I mean,
and especially of girls.
Yeah, I think one of the key elements is in, you know, in the 90s, I was on relay chat, and you would just find all these chat rooms, and there was, you know, I think it would be probably couched as engagement versus the recruitment, where they were just really engaging and building. And it's one of the things that I always use as an example, that they're 20 years ahead. They're not thinking, and the they shifts and it changes. It's, you know, I often compare it to a virus that mutates and just gets stronger and more barbaric in different forms. But the different grievances have been around for a very long time, and they've used them in different ways to, like, mobilize. And what we're seeing is that, and my theory is, as they lose territory, then they go back to the online and the cyber recruitments even more strongly. And what I've seen with the recruitment videos is it's much more targeted towards women and an empowering form towards women. They actually have women who are generals leading brigades. They actually have, you know, women that are being called into, they call them al-Mu'mineen, the mothers of the believers, to, you know, have, you know, you could be the mother of the next sultan, is the way that they describe it. And so it's an indication that they're actually planning 15 to 20 years ahead. They're thinking about raising the next generation of warriors. They're not just thinking about fighting this war. And this is always the challenge when it's ideological warfare.
And what would make, I mean, we've seen many thousands of examples of young girls being recruited to ISIS and some of them later being able to escape. But what would make a young Islamic girl want to join?
You know, it's exactly what I unpacked in the article that I was writing on CNN, because I was having a hard time answering that question, especially after the interviews. It's such a barbaric form of living. And so one of the things that came out from the recruitment, but also from the women who were making the argument, is if you're in a small village in northern Iraq or some remote area of Mali, and you have no decision-making capacity about your life, who you marry, who you go to school, and you see this video where you're not only going to have a decision, you're going to be in control. And in some cases, they're leading men. And so which life are you going to choose? And that angle of empowerment is an angle we continuously miss. And we're great about describing women as the victims, and not in any empowering way, but we at least acknowledge their role as victims. We always miss their role as perpetrators. And ISIS is definitely fully aware and playing up the role as perpetrator as a way of controlling their own life. So when you look, like we were talking about earlier, about how the day-to-day life is for a woman versus what ISIS is offering, then it suddenly becomes a more tempting package. And in most of the cases, the women choose the men. When they're recruiting for Mu'mineen, they choose who they marry. It's not the opposite way.
Seriously? In ISIS, women choose the men?
The Mu'mineen, they...
But wait a minute, the men have more than one wife. I've read about...
So you can still choose to be a second or third wife. And again, what they've done, it's not different than what we've seen throughout history of kind of the whore and the Madonna. So they have the sex slaves, they have absolute, again, barbaric abuse of women in the most heinous ways. They use sexual violence as a way of breaking communities, but then they also have this strategy of how do you deal with the Madonna, and then they have the ultimate, the highest woman. And they, from the interviews, they're living in palaces, they have, almost everything that you can imagine. They're treated like wives of sultan. And so what usually happens is they'll come and they'll say, this is the groom that I want, or this is, like, I want to be the wife of this general, and one or two wives. I mean, most of the recruitment videos, actually the posters that they have are just frightening, but it's a very much promoting 4 wives as the optimal, because they actually even have a diagram of like 1 wife, 2 kids, and then 2 wives, 4 kids, and the top of the poster is help us build the ummah, help us build the community.
But I've also read that they, especially with the young men, they don't want them to get married, they don't want them to have children, because that's going to make them want to risk their lives on the field of battle.
Yeah.
Less so.
Again, it's different strategies. So, like, if you're trying to create the wives of the sultan, then you're going to be marrying them to your top generals. You're not going to be marrying them to the young boys who are fighting the fight, or to the suicide bombers, because the goal is reproduction with this. And so yes, it is a different.
And are they reproducing? So you're saying essentially that ISIS is still 20 years ahead of us when it comes to online recruitment and keeping, building their numbers.
I think it's hard because, again, what might end up in 20 years might be a complete, ISIS might be the moderate, the same way that, people now look at Al-Qaeda and talk about some of the values and principles that they led by. Like, who thought that would be a conversation one day? So, my worry is that we're just moving towards more and more extreme forms. And so, I don't necessarily think it'll be ISIS in 20 years, is what I'm saying.
I wish you all good luck in educating young Islamic girls about sex and about their right to enjoy sex. That's it for this edition of To the Contrary. Please follow me on Twitter at Bonnie Urbay or at To the Contrary, and please go to our PBS website, which is pbs.org/To the Contrary. And whether you agree or think to the contrary, please join us next time.